The reason I wanted to invite Rod to come give this talk is over the past 18 months or so of working for myself and trying to be an entrepreneur, but coming from a technical background, like coming from this data science background, I've realized that the biggest bottleneck in my growth has not necessarily been my technical skills, like learning some new framework or brushing up on my coding skills or something like that, but it's rather been learning the non-technical skills of sales and marketing, which have made the biggest difference in being able to survive on my own as an entrepreneur. This is an experience I feel like a lot of other technical people face when they start on this journey, whether they're a freelancer or they're trying to build a product. It's most often sales and marketing are like the two biggest weak points for people. So I think Rod, as someone with tremendous experience in the field, we can all learn a lot from him. So with that, I'll just hand it over to you, Rod.
Thanks, Shaw. Appreciate it. And, look, the reality about sales and talking and, being a technical person is we're technical people, right? We like to talk. We like to go into detail. It's just the nature, right? You're really sort of pulling that thread. But there are situations where that's appropriate and situations where that's not appropriate. But before we jump into this, a little bit about me. I'm head of data solutions at Racken AI Lab. So Racken, what we do is we're a boutique services company that does data and analytics strategy, right? The big buzzword is AI these days. But if you don't have the data and clean data to do it, you're garbage in, garbage out. I mean, the interesting thing is that term has reigned true since the beginning of computers, right? Garbage in, garbage out. We also do bespoke or customized AI and machine learning models, as well as data infrastructure optimization, right? So if somebody has these AI aspirations and they don't know how to get there, right, or their data infrastructure can't support it, right, our main goal is really to help them achieve those data aspirations, not just today, but for the next 5 to 10 years, right? So really looking at their infrastructure and redesigning it in a way that it's composable, but also flexible, aligning with data fabric, data mesh methodologies. I'm also an avid practitioner, as you can see by the picture, of Ilo Gracie self-defense jiu-jitsu. I'm an instructor as well. And, really that, believe it or not, jiu-jitsu helped me in my sales career in the sense of, how do you teach a complex move to a 5-year-old? They have the attention span of a gnat. They don't pay attention. If you start getting weedy on details, you're going to lose them, right? So you really have to, it really helped me in just getting to the point, right? So to Shaw's point, right, 20 plus years in technical sales. I didn't start out that way. I was thrust into it. I was talking to Shaw before this, had the startup aspirations back in the day. And my first presentation in front of an audience was to Bank of America in Dallas. It was July. I was in a suit. I'd never been to Dallas. I didn't realize there were tunnels, right? So I'm walking up and down Main Street in Dallas looking for the Bank of America building. When I finally showed up, I was a little sweaty. Started to give the pitch, and a senior VP looks at me and says, "Hey, is this the first time you've ever given a presentation like this?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Look, take your jacket off, relax, and just tell me a story." Right. And that has really always stuck with me. And, look, if you're selling enterprise solutions, if you're teaching jujitsu, if you're trying to convince somebody of something, right, really the goal is the same. It's message clarity. And, the best presentations are effortless, but it really takes a lot of discipline and effort to build and deliver those, because again, we like to talk. And I chose this picture because number one, there's a lot of details, and I don't know if you can see that, there's varying degrees of experience in there, and some are engaged and some are kind of checked out. But also, as you're the person presenting, right, there are times when you feel like you're tipping over and why am I still talking? Why can't I stop talking? Right. You kind of get lost in the words, if you will. So I thought it was appropriate. But let's jump right into it. So when you look at this, what do you think? Right. Hey, we've got, beautiful San Francisco Bay and a very crowded boat. I live in Texas now, but I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I used to work in the city, commuted on the ferry back and forth every day. And and it wasn't fun, especially if the weather wasn't great, right? And, you know, in sales, we call this the harbor tour, right? And what I mean by that is it's this, you may have been through one. Interestingly enough, I was in one last week, and, you know, this is like a boat you can't get off. Um, I experienced one of these with my family in Boston. My wife wanted to tour the harbor, right? And I was like, oh my God, I really don't want to do this, but I did. And this is where the presenter takes you through every possible detail, right? Every buoy, every historical fact, right? Whether it's relevant to you or not, right? And just like the harbor tour, it's long, it's winding, and ultimately forgettable, right? The audience don't know where they're headed. You don't know where you're headed. There's really no destination. And what happens with that? You lose your audience. There's too much detail, too much data, not enough focus. And that's really where storytelling comes into play. And, you know, where this started to really happen more and more was during the pandemic, right? When everybody started going remote, right? You know, if you're in a room presenting to somebody, you can see them checking out. You know, once they started checking their phone, it's like, okay, I got to get them back, right? But virtually, if you're not engaged, if your audience isn't engaged, you're absolutely going to lose them. And that's why the storytelling matters, right? So people don't necessarily remember bullet points, right? What they remember is emotion, conflict, and resolution, right? So when we're talking about storytelling, you want to create that arc, right? If we think of from when we were kids or just across time, right? Information was transferred by telling stories, right? You know, you're hanging out with your friends, you know, your family, you're listening to your grandfather or grandmother, right? Tell stories from back in the day, your parents, whatever the case may be, right? And from a presentation or a demo standpoint, this is really what it's all about, leading with the outcome, right? And illustrating why, and then building clarity around what matters. And a good story really puts the audience in the driver's seat. They understand the win and they feel it, right? You know, because look, buying software, buying services, it's emotional, right? What's in it for me? People buy from people. People also buy from people that they like, right? So instead of dumping a bunch of features, you're giving meaning. And that's really the persuasion of this all, right? Um, you know, Jerome Bruner, you know, stories are 22 times more memorable than facts. I'd agree with that, right? You know, I'll remember a good story or a good joke before I'll remember a specific fact about something. You know, they're memorable and they're sticky, and they create that emotional connection, right? And the facts tell, but the stories are what sell. If we think of this traditional narrative arc, I've been demoing software for a long time, and this is the way we used to do it, right? You know, it was, hey, let me start at the beginning. Let me give you a day in the life of, and I'll walk you through this entirety, right? And then we'll have this big climax at the end. That doesn't happen today, right? In the world we live in today, the results matter. So you have to flip that narrative arc. And what I mean by that is you start with the last thing first, right? So in this case, what I want to do is really start with the result, right? I want to lead without outcome, because in a high stakes presentation, that traditional narrative arc, you're really going to lose your audience, right? You know, again, think back to that harbor tour. And we flip it, start with the outcome, because really that's what the audience is there for. You want to grab their attention with the result. And you have to think about it in the sense of you're trying to earn the next 5 minutes, right? If you have an hour, 30 minutes with somebody, you want to earn the next 5 minutes, right? Then what you can do is start to backtrack of, okay, problem, or here's a result, right? Here's your problem. These are really good with illustrations versus a bunch of bullet points, right? So in sales, we also call this the big animal pictures. I can't tell you how many times I had a bunch of bullet points on the slide. VP of sales came in, nuked it, said, no. You know, I want a big animal picture with a few data points, and then you talk to those data points, right? No more than 4, no more than 3, no more than 4. But the thing is, you then provide them the solution and that path of least resistance to get there, right? Shouldn't take any more than 5 minutes. And then you ask them what they think. And then the dialogue starts, right? So instead of going, hey, I'm going to walk you through how to use our technology. You click here, you do this, you do that. It's here's the result, right? Here's the problem that we're solving. And then this is the easy path to get there. Any questions, right? Because a lot of times, and I've seen this, look, I'm guilty of it where, well, I'll use myself as an example. I had a boss, a great mentor, and he said, yeah, great presentation, but you got to let him ask questions. And I said, what? He goes, man, you've been doing this so long. You know this technology so well. You're anticipating every question. You're answering every question in your pitch instead of letting them ask the question, right? Keep them engaged. We don't have to sit here and talk the entire time, right? 2 ears, 1 mouth. It's much better to be short, succinct, right? Think of it as an Instagram reel, right? Just a nice, quick little movie, gauge the interest, and let them ask questions, because you may go down a rat hole with all your talking and talk past the close, right? It may be too much detail, and now you have them thinking about something else. It's like, oh, this may be problematic, right? So stick to the script, right? This is where the discipline comes in, because sometimes you'll just be on a roll and not stop talking, right? And it's fascinating to watch. It's also important to understand who you're talking to, right? If you're talking to an executive, the economic buyer, because look, a CTO, a CIO, they are business people. Even though they're technical people, they're business people, right? Their point of view is really going to be, how does this help us grow? What's the return on investment? How do we win with this? When you're talking about your technical buyers, they want to understand feasibility and architecture, meaning how is this going to fit into my stack? The users, how's this going to make my life easier? Period, point blank, right? Why you buy technology, you buy automation, you buy consulting to make life easier. And then we have the gatekeepers, right? The gatekeepers are the ones where usually your toughest audience. These are the ones, technical buyers and gatekeepers. You'll have to, at times, get a little weedy with them. And, again, that's appropriate. But you don't want to come out of the gate. If you have all of these constituents in a room or on a Zoom meeting, right? You don't want to get too weedy, but you have to prioritize who you're talking to, right? Always, always, always the biggest title in the room, right? You understand their pain. You understand the problems that they're trying to solve. You do your little 5-minute vignette, right? You get them engaged, and then you go to the next one, right? So if you think about the hierarchy, and this comes with good discovery, if you think about the hierarchy of the organization, that's how you prioritize on how to present the different use cases, or how you're solving the different problems. This is a good example right here, right? So the data dump, customer churn rate dropped from 12.4% to 6.1% in Q3. Solid. But what does that mean, right? What does that mean? And think, if you have 20 of these on a slide, okay, great. How you can flip that is, hey, 3 months ago, right? 3 months ago, we were churning 1 out of every 8 customers, right? There's the tension. Gives them that mental image, right? Today, it's 1 in 16. We've cut that in half, right? 50% fewer, or 50% reduction in churn, right? That quantifies that gain. And then you sweeten the pot by monetizing it, right? So everything that we do when we're in a sales cycle, right? When we're presenting, you absolutely have to monetize it, because at some point, right? Look, people like to buy technology, but at some point, you're going to get to the person that says, what is this doing for us, right? What is this doing for us? We're not just buying technology for technology's sake. We're buying technology to solve business problems. We're not buying technology to solve a business problem, if that makes sense, right? So think of it always, always, always from the context of, how do I solve this business problem, right? And then what technologies can I use to do that? Started the business. Some storytelling strategies, right? Start with the why. Don't launch into how it works, right? start with why it matters to them. And that's the biggest thing, right? The biggest thing is if you have to talk about what matters to them. Uh, Visualizations that carry meaning, right? Meaning images shouldn't just be decoration. They should support the story, right? Because if you think back to that harbor tour, you look at that and that evokes an emotion, right? That helps me think about, okay, yeah, that doesn't look very fun, right? What are we doing here? And again, start with the end. If it's a report, start with the report. And look, it took me a long time to buy into that methodology. And I was like, no way, that's never going to work, right? Been pretty successful doing the harbor tours, the day in the life of. Once I tried it, it was an absolute game changer. And then, like I said, during the pandemic, it became an absolute necessity because people are checking out. Practice out loud, right? The way it sounds matters. You have to speak it. You're not just reading the slides, right? People absolutely hate that. You're insulting your audience. They know how to read, right? Again, just get back to the storytelling. Testify a little bit is, what we like to call it. Oops. Reframe your data as impact, right? Numbers are just noise, right? They're important to numbers people, accounting, that type of thing. But they're just noise unless you show why they actually matter and what they mean to them. And you also have to think like your audience, right? So your excitement isn't necessarily the point. Their priorities are the point, right? You're there to solve their problems, not talk about, all the cool things you know how to do or, how smart I am technically, right? Again, it's you want to, and I hate to use the term, dumb it down, but you really want to simplify it, right? And then cut ruthlessly. The last thing you want is the death by PowerPoint. Hey, it's Friday afternoon. I have 50 slides. Strap in. Here we go. Right. So, and this is the hardest part, right? Because look, if it doesn't serve the story, it doesn't belong. And clarity and simplicity is everything. And with that, I didn't want to death by PowerPoint everybody, but again, look, I can get very weedy on this, but God, we said 20 minutes. I'm at 22 right now, so I wanted to open the floor up for questions.
Yeah, it's perfect. Well, let's thank Rod for awesome talk. Hands all around. We'll open up for Q&A. So if you guys got questions, drop in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. But we've already got one here from David. Oh, actually, yeah, Tan, you go ahead. We'll prioritize the spoken.
Hey, Rod. I had a question about you addressing people like kind of in a hierarchy. So whenever you do something like that, and let's say you're presenting like a value proposition of why they should be using your app or something like that, do you go through after each step and kind of see how the higher up people are feeling, or do you present everything first and then just kind of go from there?
Yeah. So great question, right? So, think about it in the sense of you're providing the summary, right? Here's your problem, right? Supported by an illustration. Here's how you get there, right? So in the case of an app, right, first, look, taking a step back, you have to do the discovery and understand the business problem you're trying to solve from their point of view, because I can't tell you how many times I've seen users, champions, right? So think of a user as somebody who's going to use your technology day to day. The champion is the person who's been put in charge of solving this problem, and the executive is the one who is going to pay for it, right? So chop it up into vignettes in the sense of, hey, that executive has A, B, and C that they want to solve. You prove that, and then you move on to the next one, because look, you may get an hour on a calendar with an executive, but guess what? Something may come up. They may have to punch out, after 15 minutes. And if you haven't had the opportunity to pitch to the buyer, it's going to take a long time to get back on their calendar. Right. And part of this too is using his quid pro quo and qualifying out. If you can't get a meeting with the person who's signing the check, it's not a deal. It's not even close. right? Not even close. That answer your question?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one thing I'm kind of curious about, and like kind of in regards to that, like let's say you're meeting someone that does have very limited time. Would you do something like scope their LinkedIn to see kind of their like common things they talk about? So like maybe some pain points they might refer to or things that their company does well and kind of base your presentation on that? Or is that kind of like over doing it as far as that?
Depends on what stage you're in, right? If it's early, absolutely, right? Look, data is good. Being aware is good. I hate surprises. I
Right.
absolutely hate surprises, but you know what? They're going to come up. They always do. It's just Murphy's Law, right? So if you're early stage, absolutely, right? Because look, whatever you're selling, whatever you're trying to pitch, you want to make sure it's a fit, right? And again, it just has to be concise, right? Later on down the line, yeah, you're absolutely, you've done the appropriate discovery. You have an in-depth knowledge of everybody in the organization, what their pains are, and you cater to those. Also, being able to say no, right? Because we're human, right? We want to please. It's just our nature. But at some point, you're going to have to say, no, that's not in scope. That's not something that we do. Maybe I have a partner that can do that, or you're scope creeping me, which will happen all the time. Hey, I want you to do this. You start the engagement and it's, hey, can you add this? Can you add that? No. We crutch back to the written statement of work, the deliverable, the agreed upon criteria. If you're interested in that extra stuff, then we can talk about phase 2 of the project or something like that. But now, point being, if you're not talking to the executive who's going to sign the check, then you don't have a deal.
All right, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's like a signal, like if it's not a priority, enough of a priority for them to take like 30 minutes to get on a call, then it's probably not a priority for the company.
That's right. And also, happy years, right? You're in the low, you're working with lower level people. They're excited, they're fired up. You've done appropriate discovery, but you haven't done enough. You get into that meeting with the executive buyer and you tell them all the great things, everybody's fired up, and then they go, yeah, it sounds great, but it doesn't move the needle for me. These are my priorities. And the deal goes sideways immediately because, again, they've got the juice.
So we got a question in the chat from David. He asks, if you're selling a product that hasn't been introduced in the market yet, for which you can't prove it works, how would you face the can we prove it works question? I feel like this kind of aligns with the anecdote you told me before the talk, perhaps.
Well, you're going to have to, deliver at some point, right? And the way that you address those is you have success criteria. You have agreed upon terms on what you are going to do, right? If I do A, B, C, you're going to buy. This solves a problem. Now, that's usually done with the day-to-day people in the champion. But if you don't get that thumbs up from the executive, right, that, hey, I agree that this what we're going to do, this proof of concept, proof of technology, whatever you want to call it, try before you buy. If you do A, B, and C, we're going to pull the trigger, then again, you don't have a deal, right? It's a science project and we're technologists, right? We love science projects. People love to go to lunch, right? That type of thing. So, you have to get past the niceties and start asking the hard questions. That's what really, really good salespeople do is, you don't have to be, you're not a jerk about it, but it's business, right? It's business.
So are you including those outcomes as like contingencies in the deal, or are those kind of structured in the statement of work? Like we're promising we're going to deliver on like these 3 outcomes. And if that doesn't happen, like, I don't know, how do you incorporate that into like closing the deal?
You don't guarantee success, right? So you keep it functional, right? In the sense of, look, if it's technology that looks at, a transactional digital channel that's making $1 million a day, and you promise, hey, I'm going to find, $5 million in revenue leakage in 2 weeks, hey, you better strap in, right? It's not a guarantee. But if you position it as, look, I'm going to give you optics into how every one of your customers are interacting with your digital channel. Check. We're not going to impact the existing infrastructure. Check, right? So it's not a guarantee of results, right? Because you want those to sweeten the pot at the end, right? If you can throw those in at the end, for sure. But as you're developing that, success criteria, if you will, you want to make sure it's achievable goals that your technology can deliver on today, not futures, not promises of results. It's just functional requirements only.
Yeah, I really like that. Keep the questions coming. I got a few, so I'll try to squeeze mine in while I have the opportunity. I can imagine, I like the things you're saying. It's like, tell a story, start with the impact, don't drown people in numbers and data and information, kind of communicate the meaning, the emotion, how this is going to impact their lives. I'm curious, I imagine these principles will be applied in different flavors depending on what you're selling. So
Sure.
If you're talking about a SaaS product, it might be one way. If you're selling consulting services, it might be another way. If you're selling implementation, that's going to be another thing. So I'm just curious, how these principles might be applied slightly differently, or what these different contexts might have in common and some key differences.
Well, the commonality is, number one, keep it simple, but it's really the approach on how you're delivering, I guess is the best way to say it, right? Because look, I sell services now, right? I don't sell technology. And that approach is, this massive, well, I'd say on average 100 to 125 slide PowerPoint presentation of every optimization, right? Meeting with business users and this and that. Now, would I present something like that to somebody in one sitting? Absolutely not, right? So you kind of little bits and pieces, right? If you have everybody in a room, right, you just give the little samples of it. And look, what that does is get them engaged, and then you can have the sidebars to go really deep and wide, right? What you don't want to do is go deep and wide with a mixed audience, because if 3/4 of the audience has no idea what you're talking about, you're going to lose, right? So that's really my approach. But again, it takes that discipline not to go weedy really fast.
So when you're selling services, you have all these key things that you might want to communicate or get across, but this isn't all going to be in one meeting. It's going to be split out over multiple meetings over
Correct.
multiple months or something like that. I'm curious, how this might change, because I imagine these long sales cycles, it's going to be for enterprise customers, maybe some larger mid-sized companies. But how does this look differently for startups or small businesses or medium-sized companies? What is the thing that changes as the company size changes?
Well, it's actually gotten a little worse because I would say today versus yesterday. I mean, there's always been consensus, but now more and more people need to buy in. And it depends on what you're selling, right? If I'm selling you an umbrella shop, right, I'm not going to talk about the metal, right? I'm not going to talk about the wood on the handle. It's look, man, you live in Texas, it's hot and it's fixing to rain, right? That solves the problem. So you have to go chase customers that align with your size of company and that you can support, right? So if, and look, the interesting thing, and I don't think, I certainly didn't realize this, that if you think of these big companies, right, there are hundreds of different lines of businesses in that organization. Start with one, right? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You know what I mean? So, start small, sell into what you can support, right? And then you can grow from there, right? Because you want that success. I mean, look, Shaw, you know this, right? You need those referrals from the customers, right? Somebody who has used you or somebody you built products for, that is a much better lead than, hey, some Instagram ad or a Google ad or whatever the case may be, right? Especially amongst trusted peers, right? If I know somebody and they bought your stuff and is like, yeah, man, he killed it for me. Okay, great. Let's talk.
Yeah, that's awesome. Any other questions? Drop in the chat. Feel free to come off mute.
Yeah, we've got 3 of us, or 5 of us total. So don't be shy.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
have
Dan.
one question. So,
You bet.
one thing I've been kind of thinking about is how often should you like kind of pursue someone that isn't really closing a deal? It's like how many times do you really like try to re-meet with them to seal the deal? Because sometimes it feels like you're kind of just chasing a never-ending like goal. Because I feel like there's been a few times where I've met with clients where they want like there's a team that wants to implement a solution, but the leadership doesn't really care for it. So it's like the team keeps wanting to meet, but the leadership doesn't seem to actually execute on it. So do you try to like convince the leadership, or do you just at some point give up on that?
Well, you're kind of chasing smoke, right? Because
Right.
again, the leadership is the one who's going to pull the trigger and sign the check. But if you're, perhaps you haven't done appropriate discovery, right? And you really don't
Right.
know what makes that person or group of leadership tick, right? Or they have different priorities, right? Maybe the timing's not right. Sales and deals, timing's everything. Hey, may not be a fit for you right now. I think it is. Maybe where you're at, you don't see it yet. Let me contact you in 6 months, right? But to just
Yeah.
continue, saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to drive this square peg into this round hole." Look, if they don't want it, they don't want it. That also comes with having the professionalism to really ask those hard questions, right?
Right.
Look, what do you think makes sense, right? I keep bugging you. You don't want to be mean to me, right? You're being kind. As soon as we hang up the phone or jump off the Zoom, you're probably talking trash or, why does this person keep calling me? Ask them. People will be
Right.
candid, right? And that's the hardest part is getting past that veneer, if you will, right?
Right.
Look, you're running a business, right? This is how we all feed our families, right? This is how we support ourselves. You have to be able to ask those hard questions.
It makes sense. Thanks.
And you can be professional about it, right?
You're
Yeah.
right. Just shake them down for money. That's my solution. It's like
Well, again, it goes back to the happy years. The hardest thing about, look, so my career, I've worked for small companies, been acquired by IBM twice, right? And I was a second level manager, right? A manager of managers in IBM. And, I was the deal killer, right? It would, you had to get approval before you could do a proof of concept, right? Because look, that's time, that's travel, that's expenses. It's expensive. It just drives up the cost of the sale, right? You have to prove it's a real deal, right? Because guess what? My boss is going to ask me that, right? Just like you have to forecast, I have to forecast. I don't like to forecast smoke. I'm the type of person that likes to under promise and over deliver, right? And look, if it's not a deal, it's not a deal. You can't force it.
I've been on both sides of the table. I actually buy a lot of software, being in a finance role, but at the same time, um, we're also starting up a small software company. And one of the things that I experience on both sides is at the end of the call, right? You told all of the story, and then there is this so what? What's next question?
That's right.
There's always this kind of 30 seconds of awkwardness, right? I've seen an approach of you have a budget for it, who needs to approve, and there are something that's more smooth, right? But so I just want to see like at the master level, how does that experience should go down, and what are the questions you should be asked?
At the end, I mean, when they're talking to you.
Yeah. Like when we're selling, right? Like how do I, as a seller, how do I move the process along?
So that goes back to discovery of you understanding how they buy, right? That, you know, that absolutely needs to be mapped out, right? You know, because every good salesperson has a close document, right? And then there's timelines and dates associated with that and commitments, meaning that, look, we're doing A, B, and C. We're meeting with this team, but you know, as you start, you know, as a deal starts to become a deal and you get close to that close, right? Understand their timing, right? You know, is it the end of their quarter? Are you going to be able to get a hold of legal, right? Are you going to, is your legal team going to be available? You're right, because there's all the contract stuff that goes outside of the selling, but the salesperson is still responsible for herding those cats, if you will, right? So if you're the finance person, you're the one signing the deal. Are you on vacation for the next 2 weeks, right? You know, it's those type of things, just being excruciatingly detailed about your close plan and what are those steps to close. And look, if you've got a good champion, they will help you navigate that. And you know, again, that's a good sign. If you don't have a good champion that's helping you understand how a company purchases software, purchases services, then you really don't have a deal.
Got it. So just kind of to play it back to you, it's worth kind of very specifically ask, what does your logistics look like? Not phrased in that direct manner, but you want to know all of these different things that might throw things apart.
You know, I can't tell you how many times we've talked to a champion and says, how do you buy software? I don't know. I really don't, right? So you're actually helping them, you know, because you're really acting as that tip of the spear. Maybe they're uncomfortable asking the questions. It's like, look, yeah, we'll be the pushy sales team. We'll help you out, right? And that's where you build that rapport and relationship, you know, because they can go, hey, you know, I've got this such and such, right? They can blame you for having to ask the hard questions. I'm being asked these questions. I don't know where to go, right? I don't know what to do, right? Oh, hey, escalate to their manager. Okay, now we're a step higher in the chain. You get that introduction, right? And say, hey, let me ask all the hard questions. But you have to ask those hard questions. And look, if it's building that relationship with your champion, right? If they're not willing to hold your hand through every piece of the organization, it's going to be tough to get a deal done. You know, because they're solving a problem. And look, there may be cases where they have the juice and budget to solve the problem at their level, right? And pay for it. They may be the champion and economic buyer. But if it's something a little broader, right? You mentioned you worked in finance, right? If we're talking, you know, 250 grand a year contract, right? It's going to have to go through finance. There's going to need to be justification. There's going to need to be an executive sponsor, right? For 250 grand. And, you know, usually depending on the size of the organization, there's budget discretion, right? On how much somebody can sign for.
Makes sense. Yeah. Kind of comes back to this organizational dynamics that you mentioned at the beginning.
And, you know, look, interesting, like IBM has, you know, some good software, some not so great, but you'll never get fired by an IBM, right? You make a decision and buy, you know, some startup company stuff and it doesn't work out, right? You're putting your career on the line. You really are.
All right. Any more questions? I think we're kind of getting close to the end, or maybe we're a little over, but if there's one last question, we can squeeze it in before we drop.
I'll squeeze in one last thing.
Yeah.
What is the most, like, having been in all of these sales calls, probably, you know, coaching some of your team members as well, what's the most common mistake that you wish, you know, people just don't do over and over again?
There's no shortcuts, right? There's no shortcuts. You have to walk. I mean, there's optimizations, but if you get lazy, right, and don't do every detail, right, that you have on your close plan, that you have on your discovery checklist, right, then deals go sideways, right? It's having to look. We all like the easy button, right? But I didn't learn jujitsu by some magic button, right? It was hours and hours of getting tortured, quite candidly, by very large young men here in the great state of Texas. And then finally you start to figure it out. But, you know, look, there's a detail, you miss a detail, it could be devastating to your sales cycle, right? So just having the discipline to continue to walk that path, right? And it becomes muscle memory, right? You know, where you're asking the questions, and then you start to, you know, realize, I really don't know this. I got to find this out before I commit this deal. You know, especially if you're working in a sales organization and you have investors, right, that you're reporting sales to. They don't want smoke. They want real deals, right? They have to be demonstrable, forecastable opportunities. And if there's any lack of detail in there, you look, when because it's usually in a group forum where deal reviews happen, and there's a lot of like former Division I athletes that work in software sales. It's torturous. They don't hold back, right? They do not hold back. A lot of male and female former athletes. So, you know, the expectations are high, and, you know, whatever they're good at, you know, whether it's rowing, whether it's archery, whether it's golf, you know, they walk the path, right? And they expect you to do the same with your deals. So
Thank you.
Just don't short.
I think that's a great place to end. Never skip the basics. Follow the checklist. All right, well, let's thank Rod once again for an awesome presentation and answering all the questions. And with that, thank you guys again for joining, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.